Hold up, sir. ID, let me see it.
Excuse me? I'm headed to a meeting.
Badge.
Here. That's federal credentials, been on this base all week.
Doesn't mean you just stroll past the checkpoint. Let's go. Security office.
Are you serious? This is unnecessary.
Alcee, move.
The security camera at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall in Arlington, Virginia, shows a black man in his early 40s walking across a parking lot toward Building 27 at 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September. He's wearing a charcoal suit, white shirt, tie, polished shoes, carrying a leather briefcase, walking with the purposeful stride of someone who's made this exact walk hundreds of times before. The base is quiet. Early morning. Just a few people heading to their offices. The man's name is Dr. Jonathan Hayes, and he's a senior defense analyst at the Pentagon with a top-secret/sensitive compartmented information clearance. He's briefed 4-star generals. He's written policy recommendations that influence billions in defense spending. He's testified before Congress. And in approximately 90 seconds, he's going to be stopped by a security officer who's going to decide that a black man in a suit doesn't look like he belongs on a military installation. What that security officer doesn't know is that stopping Jonathan Hayes is going to trigger an investigation that exposes a pattern 18 months in the making, that it's going to cost a security contractor $4.7 million and their contract with the military, that it's going to create new protocols for every military base in the United States, and that by the time it's over, that security officer will be working retail in Ohio, trying to figure out where his career went. But right now, in his patrol vehicle parked near Building 27, Officer Tyler Bennett is just watching a man walk across a parking lot and making assumptions. Bennett is 29 years old, former Army military police, been working private security on military installations for 3 years through secure guard contractors. His job is to monitor foot traffic, check for security violations, stop anyone who looks out of place. That last part is where things get subjective, where bias becomes action, where someone's feeling becomes someone else's. Problem: he's sitting in his vehicle finishing coffee when he sees Jonathan walking across the parking lot. Something about it doesn't sit right with him. Can't articulate what exactly. Just a feeling. Later, when investigators ask him to explain why he decided to stop Jonathan, Bennett will say the man wasn't wearing visible identification and looked out of place. When pressed on what specifically looked out of place about a man in a suit carrying a briefcase on a military base full of people in suits carrying briefcases, Bennett won't have a good answer. But right now he's not thinking about how he'll explain it later. He's just reacting to the feeling. He puts his coffee down, gets out of his vehicle, and starts walking toward Jonathan. Jonathan is thinking about the briefing he's giving at 8 a.m. He's running slightly late. Usually arrives by 7:30, but hit traffic this morning. He's mentally reviewing his talking points about Chinese hypersonic missile development. He's thinking about whether General Richardson will push back on his assessment that the threat timeline is shorter than current intelligence estimates suggest. He's not thinking about security. He walks this route every day. He knows every camera, knows which buildings are which. He's been doing this for 3 years without incident. He doesn't notice Bennett approaching until the voice cuts through his thoughts. "Sir, stop right there. I need to see your identification." Jonathan stops, turns around, sees the security officer, younger guy, white, moving with that particular authority that comes from wearing a uniform and having the power to make people's day difficult. Jonathan feels the familiar weight of this moment settling on him. He's been stopped before, not on base, usually, in parking lots, in stores. Once in the Pentagon itself by a guard who'd worked there 2 months and didn't recognize him despite Jonathan having worked there 9 years. Each time, there's that split-second calculation. Comply quickly and move on, or push back and make it a thing. My ID? I'm walking to my office. I work here. Bennett stops about 6 feet away, hand resting on his belt near his radio. I'll determine if you work here. ID now. Jonathan keeps his voice level despite the irritation rising. I've been walking this route to my office every day for 3 years. What's the problem? The problem is you're on a secure military installation without visible identification. Show me your badge or you're being detained. Jonathan reaches slowly for his wallet, making his movements deliberate and visible because he's a black man in America, and he knows what happens when movements are misinterpreted. My badge is in my wallet. I'm reaching for it now, slowly. Are you going to tell me why you stopped me and not the 3 other people who just walked past in the last 5 minutes? Bennett stiffens. I'm asking the questions here. Show me the ID. Jonathan pulls out his Pentagon badge. It's a blue badge with his photo, his name, and the Department of Defense seal. Senior Analyst is printed clearly under his name along with his clearance level designation. He holds it up. Bennett takes the badge, examines it, looks at Jonathan, looks at the badge again. His expression doesn't change, but something in his body language suggests he's not satisfied. This could be fake. I've seen people with fake badges before. Jonathan stares at him. Fake? You think I faked a Pentagon ID badge with a TS/SCI clearance designation to walk around a military base at 7 in the morning? People steal badges. It happens. Then verify it. Run it through your system. But are you going to tell me why you stopped me in the first place? What specific security concern prompted you to stop me when you're not stopping anyone else walking to work? And here's where Bennett says, the thing that's going to end up in investigation reports and congressional testimony and training materials about implicit bias. He says it without thinking, without realizing how it sounds, just saying what's true in his head. I stopped you because you don't look like you belong on this base. Jonathan goes very still. The briefing he was thinking about disappears from his mind. I don't look like I belong. What does someone who belongs on a military base look like? Officer, he reads the name tag. Bennett? Bennett realizes he might have made a mistake, but doubles down instead of backing off. I'm not doing this with you. You're coming with me to base security for verification. We'll sort this out there. You want to detain a Pentagon analyst on a military base for walking to work? Fine. Jonathan's voice is calm, but there's steel underneath now. Take me to security. Call my supervisor. But I promise you, by the end of today, you're going to wish you'd asked yourself why a black man in a suit walking on base made you assume he was a security threat. Bennett gestures toward his. There are cameras and witnesses. You don't want to get caught in the act. If you're detaining me, we're walking to base security together where there are cameras and witnesses. You don't get to drive me somewhere and have this be your word against mine. They walk to the base security office. It takes 8 minutes. Bennett walks slightly behind Jonathan, like he's escorting a suspect. Jonathan uses the time to think through what happens next. He's been working with the Department of Defense long enough to know how bureaucracies work and how they resist accountability. But he also knows that he's not some junior analyst who can be brushed off. He has access, he has relationships, he has the Secretary of Defense's office on speed dial, and he's not letting this go. When they arrive at the security office, Bennett approaches the desk sergeant and explains that he stopped someone without visible ID who may have a fake badge. The desk sergeant is Staff Sergeant Linda Torres, Army, 20 years in. She looks at Jonathan, then at his badge, then back at Bennett with an expression that suggests she's seen this movie before and knows how it ends. Sir, what's your name and where do you work? Dr. Jonathan Hayes, Senior Defense Analyst at the Pentagon, Office of Net Assessment. I've been walking to work through this base for 3 years without incident until this morning. Torres takes the badge, runs it through the verification system. The computer comes back immediately. Hayes, Jonathan, DOD, TS/SCI clearance. Status, active, No flags, no holds, completely valid. She looks at the screen for a moment, then at Bennett, and her expression shifts from neutral to irritated. This badge is valid. Dr. Hayes is cleared to be on this installation. She turns to Jonathan. Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to go. But Bennett isn't ready to let it go. Sergeant, he wasn't displaying visible identification. I was following protocol. Torres turns on him. Protocol is to verify credentials when you have reasonable suspicion of a security violation. What violation did you suspect? What specific behavior made you think Dr. Hayes was a security threat? Bennett hesitates. He just looked... He didn't look like... Didn't look like what? Torres's voice has an edge now. Choose your next words carefully, Officer Bennett. Bennett doesn't finish the sentence. Torres turns back to Jonathan. Dr. Hayes, again, I apologize. Officer Bennett should have handled this differently. Jonathan doesn't move. I want to file a formal complaint. Officer Bennett stopped me without reasonable cause, questioned my credentials despite them being valid, and stated explicitly that I don't look like I belong on this base. I want his full name, badge number, and the name of the security contractor he works for. I also want the incident report number and copies of any footage from this interaction. Torres nods. I'll get you that. Information right now. She starts typing, pulling up Bennett's information. Bennett is standing there, looking uncomfortable. Starting to realize this might not just blow over the way stops usually do. Jonathan pulls out his phone. Dials a number. Jennifer? It's Jonathan. I need you to contact General Richardson's office and let them know I'm going to be late for the 8 o'clock briefing. I was just detained on base by a security officer who decided I didn't look like I belonged here. He pauses, listening. Yes, I'm serious. I'll be there as soon as I can and I'll explain everything. He hangs up. Takes the information Torres provides. Looks at Bennett. Officer Bennett, you should call your supervisor, because this isn't going away. Have you ever been somewhere you absolutely belonged and had someone question your right to be there while others walked past without a glance? Drop a comment, because what happens next is what happens when someone with institutional power decides they're done accepting it. Jonathan walks to the Pentagon, checks in through the proper entrance, goes to his office. His colleague David Chen is already there. Hey, where were you? Richardson's people called asking if you were coming. I was getting detained on base by security. Jonathan drops his briefcase and sits down. His hands are shaking slightly, not from fear but from anger he's been controlling since the parking lot. Guy stopped me, said I didn't look like I belonged on base, detained me even after verifying my badge was valid. David stares at him. Are you serious? Dead serious. And I'm not letting this go? Not this time. Jonathan spends the next hour preparing his briefing materials. Then he walks to the conference room and briefs General Richardson and 3 other senior officers on Chinese missile capabilities. He doesn't mention what happened that morning during the briefing, stays professional, delivers his assessment, answers their questions. But afterward, he makes another call, this one to the Pentagon's Equal Employment Opportunity Office. The complaint Jonathan files is detailed and specific. Officer Tyler Bennett, Badge 2847, Secure Guard Contractors, stopped him at 7:42 a.m. on September 14th without reasonable suspicion of any security violation. Bennett demanded identification. Jonathan provided his valid Pentagon badge with active TS/SCI clearance. Bennett declared it might be fake and detained Jonathan for verification despite having no basis for that suspicion. Bennett stated explicitly that he stopped Jonathan because he didn't look like he belonged on base. Jonathan is requesting a full investigation into whether Bennett has engaged in a pattern of racial profiling in his security stops. The EEO office takes the complaint seriously. Not every complaint gets forwarded to the Inspector General, but when a senior analyst with a TS/SCI clearance files a detailed discrimination complaint naming a specific contractor employee, it gets attention. The complaint is forwarded to the Defense Department Inspector General's office within 24 hours. The IG assigns the case to senior investigator Sarah Mitchell. She's been with the IG for 12 years, spent 8 years before that as a criminal investigator with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. She reads Jonathan's complaint and immediately sees the problem. If Bennett stopped Jonathan based on appearance rather than behavior, and if this is a pattern rather than a one-time error, then SecureGuard has been allowing discriminatory security practices on a military installation for however long Bennett's been there. Mitchell starts pulling data. She requests all of Bennett's stop reports for the 18 months he's been assigned to Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall. SecureGuard has to provide them under the IG's authority. Within a week, Mitchell has 247 incident reports sitting on her desk. She starts coding them. She creates a spreadsheet. Date, time, location, race of individuals stopped, stated reason for stop, outcome. It takes her 3 days to code all 247 reports. When she's done, she stares at the numbers for a long time before calling her supervisor. Tom, I need you to look at something. Her supervisor, Tom Davidson, comes to her desk. She shows him the spreadsheet. 247 stops. 189 were of Black or Hispanic service members and civilian employees. That's 76%. She pulls up the base demographics. Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall is 31% Black and Hispanic combined. Bennett is stopping minorities at more than twice their representation in the population. Could be random, Tom says, playing devil's advocate. Could be that minorities are more likely to forget their badges or... Mitchell cuts him off. I checked the outcomes. Of the 189 minority stops, 172 had valid credentials and were immediately released. That's a 91% false positive rate. He's stopping people who have every right to be there. She runs more. Analysis. Of Bennett's 247 stops, 143 were for no visible identification. But when she cross-references with outcomes, 127 of those 143 had valid identification and were released. 16 were found to have expired or invalid credentials. That's an 11% hit rate. Bennett is wrong 89% of the time when he stops someone for identification issues. Then she breaks it down by race. Hit rate for Black and Hispanic individuals, 9%. Hit rate for white individuals, 23%. The disparity is statistically significant. Bennett is stopping Black and Hispanic personnel based on hunches that are wrong 91% of the time, while his stops of white personnel are wrong only 77% of the time. Mitchell brings this to her supervisor. This isn't random. This is a pattern. Bennett has been racially profiling people for 18 months. Can you prove it's intentional and not just bad judgment? He told Dr. Hayes explicitly that he stopped him because he didn't look like he belonged. That's not judgment. That's bias. The investigation expands. Mitchell and her team interview Jonathan in detail. They interview Staff Sergeant Torres, who confirms that Bennett's stated reason for the stop was appearance-based. They pull Bennett's personnel file from SecureGuard and find something interesting. 2 prior complaints at other installations. One from a Navy commander who said Bennett stopped him 3 times in 2 weeks. One from an Air Force major who said Bennett questioned whether his credentials were valid despite the system confirming them. Both complainants were Black. Both complaints were filed with SecureGuard but marked as no action required, because Bennett's supervisor said he was just being thorough. Mitchell decides to interview some of the other 188 people Bennett stopped. She contacts 40 of them. 32 agree to be interviewed. Their stories are remarkably similar. Stopped while walking to work. Asked for credentials despite wearing visible badges. Questioned about whether they belonged on base. Detained while their credentials were verified despite the system showing they were valid. Several mention feeling singled out because white colleagues walked past without being stopped. One of the interviews hits Mitchell particularly hard. Major Angela Price, Army, 15 years of service, works in logistics at the Pentagon. Bennett stopped her 4 times in 6 months. Same route, same time of day. Each time he said she wasn't displaying identification even though her badge was clipped to her belt. Each time he verified her credentials and released her. Each time she felt humiliated and angry, but didn't file a complaint because she didn't think anyone would care. "Did you see him stop other people on that route?" Mitchell asks. "Never, just me. I started taking a different route to avoid him." Mitchell adds Major Price's testimony to the report. She interviews 7 more people with similar stories. Multiple stops. Questioned credentials, felt targeted, didn't report because they assumed nothing would happen. 3 months after Jonathan filed his complaint, Mitchell completes her investigation. The report is 127 pages. The findings are unequivocal. Officer Tyler Bennett engaged in a pattern of racially discriminatory security stops over 18 months at Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall. Bennett stopped Black and Hispanic personnel at 2.45 times their representation in the base population. His stated reasons for stops were pretextual, as evidenced by an 89% false positive rate overall and a 91% false positive rate for minority stops. Bennett's stops were not justified by legitimate security concerns and were concentrated disproportionately on minority personnel. His statement to Dr. Hayes that Hayes didn't look like he belonged reflected racial bias rather than security assessment. The report recommends immediate termination of Bennett's contract, review of Secure Guard, contractors' supervision practices, investigation of Bennett's prior assignments for similar patterns, and implementation of mandatory data collection and oversight for all contractor security personnel on DoD installations. The report lands on the desk of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for sustainment 3 days before Christmas. She reads it over the holiday weekend. On December 27th, she calls a meeting with the General Counsel, the Director of the IG, and senior officials from Secure Guard contractors. The meeting is not pleasant. The Assistant Secretary makes it clear that the Department of Defense takes civil rights violations seriously, especially on military installations. Secure Guard's representatives try to argue that Bennett was a rogue employee, that the company has proper oversight, that this doesn't reflect their training or policies. The IG investigators present the data showing that Bennett's supervisors received complaints about his stop patterns and did nothing. The General Counsel points out that Secure Guard's contract requires compliance with all federal anti-discrimination laws, and that the IG report documents systematic violations. Tyler Bennett is fired on December 30th. The termination letter cites gross misconduct, violation of civil rights, failure to follow proper security procedures, and conduct unbecoming a security professional. Bennett tries to appeal through his union, but the union declines to represent him after reviewing the IG report. The evidence is too overwhelming. Secure Guard contractors receives a formal notice on January 5th that their contract with Joint Base Myer-Henderson Hall is being terminated for cause. The contract is worth $3.2 million annually. Secure Guard appeals, arguing that one employee's misconduct shouldn't result in company-wide penalties. The appeal is denied on January 20th. The contracting officer's decision memo cites the IG finding that Secure Guard's supervisors failed to address Bennett's pattern, despite receiving complaints, demonstrating that the problem was not just one employee but inadequate supervision and oversight. But Jonathan isn't satisfied with Bennett being fired and Secure Guard losing one contract. On January 15th, he files a federal lawsuit, Hayes versus Bennett, Secure Guard Contractors Incorporated, and the Department of Defense. The complaint alleges unlawful detention, violation of civil rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments, discrimination based on race in violation of Title VII, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent supervision. The complaint doesn't just detail what happened to Jonathan, it includes the IG report as an exhibit. It lists the 189 minority stops. It includes testimony from Major Price and 6 other service members who were stopped multiple times. It argues that Bennett's pattern demonstrates willful discrimination, not mere negligence, and that Secure Guard enabled it by failing to supervise properly despite receiving complaints. Jonathan is asking for $4.7 million in damages plus comprehensive reforms to security practices across all military installations. The lawsuit becomes news immediately. Pentagon Analyst sues after being racially profiled on military base. The Washington Post runs it. Military Times covers it. Defense News picks it up. The story resonates because everyone in the military has dealt with overzealous security at some point. But this case documents a pattern that goes beyond zealousness into discrimination. The DoD doesn't want this going to trial. Neither does Secure Guard, which is hemorrhaging other contracts as military installations review their security arrangements in light of the IG report. 2 weeks after the lawsuit is filed, Secure Guard's attorneys reach out about settlement. Jonathan's attorney, Rebecca Chen, is a civil rights litigator who's been practicing for 18 years. She tells them the number, $4.7 million plus reforms. Secure Guard balks. That's excessive for a stop that lasted 15 minutes. The damages aren't for 15 minutes. They're for a pattern that lasted 18 months and affected at least 189 people. The reforms aren't negotiable. If you want to avoid trial, these are the terms. Secure Guard offers $1.2 million with no admission of wrongdoing and no reforms. Jonathan rejects it immediately. This isn't about money. This is about making sure this doesn't happen to the next person who walks to work on a military base. The case is set for trial in 8 months. Discovery begins. Rebecca deposes Bennett. The deposition lasts 7 hours over 2 days. Bennett tries to argue that he was just doing his job, that he stopped people who weren't displaying credentials. That race had nothing to do with it. Rebecca walks him through his stop reports one by one. Mr. Bennett, on September 3rd, you stopped Captain Williams, a black officer in the Army. Your report says no visible identification. Captain Williams testified that his badge was clipped to his belt. Did you see his badge before you stopped him? I don't recall specifically. You don't recall. On September 3rd, did you stop anyone who wasn't black or Hispanic? I don't remember everyone I stopped. We have your reports. On September 3rd, you made 4 stops. All 4 were of minority personnel. 3 had visible badges. 1 had his badge in his wallet. All 4 were valid. Did you stop anyone that day who was white? I stopped people based on security concerns, not race. That's not what I asked. Did you stop anyone white on September 3rd? Bennett doesn't answer. Rebecca moves to the next report, and the next. Building a record that shows the pattern is undeniable. 4 months before trial, Secure Guard's attorneys request mediation. The mediator is a former federal judge with 30 years on the bench. The mediation is scheduled for 2 full days at a conference center in Arlington. Day 1 starts with both sides in separate rooms. The mediator shuttles between them. Secure Guard opens at $2.8 million with limited reforms. Jonathan counters at $4.7 million with comprehensive reforms affecting all DoD installations. The mediator spends 6 hours trying to find middle ground. By the end of day 1, they're deadlocked. Day 2 starts with the mediator bringing everyone into one room. Let's stop negotiating through me and talk directly about what needs to happen here. SecureGuard's lead attorney speaks first. Our position is that Mr. Bennett was a bad employee who we've already fired. We've lost our contract. We're prepared to compensate Dr. Hayes for his experience, but requiring reforms across 234 military installations affecting 40,000 security personnel is beyond the scope of this case. Jonathan speaks next. He's sitting across the table from 3 SecureGuard attorneys and 2 DoD lawyers. The scope of this case is exactly those 234 installations and 40,000 personnel. Because what happened to me is happening at bases across the country. The IG report documented 189 discriminatory stops in 18 months at one base. How many thousands of stops are happening at other bases with no oversight? The reforms I'm asking for are simple. Collect demographic data on stops. Review the data quarterly. Intervene when patterns emerge. Train security personnel on implicit bias. These aren't burdensome. They're basic accountability. The DoD lawyer speaks. Dr. Hayes, the department agrees that what happened to you shouldn't have happened. But implementing reforms across the entire military is a resource question. The cost of data collection systems, analysis, training, we're talking tens of millions of dollars. Jonathan leans forward. What's the cost of discrimination? What's the cost to morale when service members feel like they're being targeted on their own bases? What's the cost when talented people leave the military because they're tired of being questioned about whether they belong? You're worried about the cost of data collection. I'm worried about the cost of not collecting it. Rebecca Chen adds, the reforms Dr. Hayes is proposing are already industry standard in civilian law enforcement. Major police departments track stop data, analyze it, intervene when problems emerge. The military is behind the curve on this. My client is offering you a chance to get ahead of the problem before the next lawsuit, and the one after that. The mediator lets the silence sit for a moment. Then, he speaks. SecureGuard, let me ask you directly. Can you defend your supervision of Officer Bennett at trial? Can you explain why you didn't address his stop pattern despite receiving complaints? Can you put witnesses on the stand who'll say you had proper oversight? SecureGuard's attorneys look at each other. The answer is no, and everyone in the room knows it. The IG report documented that Bennett's supervisor received at least 3 complaints about his stop patterns and took no action. At trial, that's going to look like deliberate indifference. What if we agree to reforms but limit them to bases where SecureGuard has contracts? One of the attorneys suggests. Jonathan shakes his head. That's 47 bases. It doesn't address the systematic problem. The reforms need to be DoD-wide or we're going to trial. Another 3 hours of negotiation. The number comes down slightly to $4.5 million. The reforms stay comprehensive, but the implementation timeline extends to 18 months instead of 6. Jonathan agrees to that. The DoD agrees to mandate the reforms across all installations through a policy directive that will be binding on all contractors. At 6:47 p.m. on day 2, they have a deal. $4.5 million total. $1.8 million to Jonathan personally. $2.7 million to establish a fund for implementing data collection, analysis, and training systems across all DoD installations. SecureGuard pays the full amount. Bennett is personally liable for $50,000, which will be garnished from his wages for the foreseeable future. The settlement also includes the reforms Jonathan demanded: mandatory demographic data collection for all security stops at military installations. Beginning within 6 months, data must include race, stated reason for stop, outcome, and duration. Quarterly analysis of stop patterns by installation and by individual security personnel. any personnel showing racial disparities of 2 to 1 or greater between stops of minorities versus stops of whites will be flagged for supervisory review. Early intervention for security personnel flagged 3 quarters in a row, including retraining or reassignment. Annual implicit bias training for all security personnel, contractor and military, across all installations. Civilian Oversight Board at each major installation, with authority to review stop data and recommend policy changes. The reforms affect 234 military installations and approximately 40,000 security personnel. The settlement is finalized on March 3rd. The announcement becomes national news. Pentagon Analyst lawsuit triggers sweeping security reforms at military bases. The coverage emphasizes both the individual wrong and the systemic response. Civil rights organizations call it a landmark settlement. Military civil liberties groups call it long overdue. Jonathan does one interview with NPR. The host asks him why he pushed for reforms instead of just taking a settlement and moving on. Because I'm fortunate. I have education. I have position. I have resources. I could file a complaint and people took it seriously. But Major Price, who was stopped 4 times in 6 months, she thought nothing would happen if she complained, and she was probably right based on how the system worked before this. The reforms are about making sure the next time someone gets stopped for no reason, there's a mechanism to catch it before it becomes a pattern. The data collection makes the invisible visible, and once it's visible, it's harder to ignore. The interviewer asks about Bennett. Do you feel like justice was served? Jonathan pauses before answering. Bennett lost his job. That's appropriate. But he's one person. The system that allowed him to operate for 18 months without anyone noticing the pattern, that's the bigger problem. If the reforms prevent the next Bennett from operating unchecked, then yes, that's justice. Not just for me, for everyone who comes after. The body cam footage from that September morning is released as part of the settlement. The footage shows Jonathan walking across a parking lot in a suit. Shows Bennett stopping him, shows Jonathan providing his badge, shows Bennett saying it might be fake, shows Jonathan explaining he's a Pentagon analyst, shows Bennett saying he doesn't look like he belongs. The footage is viewed 19 million times in the first month. Tyler Bennett never worked security again. He tried getting hired at other firms. None would take him after the IG report became public. He moved to Ohio, works as an assistant manager at a retail store now. His LinkedIn profile doesn't mention his 3 years in military security. Jonathan is still at the Pentagon, still a senior defense analyst, still briefing generals. But he's also become an advocate for military personnel who experience discrimination. He speaks at Armed Forces Equal Opportunity conferences. He advises installation commanders on implementing the new security protocols. He's testified before the House Armed Services Committee about bias in security operations. 2 years after he was stopped, the data collection mandated by his settlement has produced results. In the first year, military installations identified 73 security personnel with stop patterns showing significant racial disparities. 41 were terminated or reassigned. 32 received retraining and are being monitored. The oversight is working. Jonathan still walks across that parking lot every morning. Different security contractor now, different personnel. He hasn't been stopped again. 2 weeks ago, he saw a new security officer on patrol who nodded at him and said, "Morning, sir." Jonathan nodded back and kept walking. It's a small thing. It shouldn't feel significant, but it does. Because it's what should have happened from the beginning. What stays with me about this story isn't just that Bennett lost his job or that SecureGuard lost millions. It's what Bennett said that morning. "You don't look like you belong on this base." That's the most honest thing anyone said throughout this entire case, because it reveals the assumption. Bennett looked at Jonathan and couldn't conceive of a black man in a suit being a Pentagon analyst, couldn't imagine that someone who looked like Jonathan could have the clearances, the education, the position that Jonathan had earned over 15 years. That assumption, that moment of deciding who belongs, based on appearance rather than credentials, that's what cost Bennett his career. That's what cost SecureGuard $4.5 million and their contracts. That's what triggered reforms across 234 installations. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Bennett probably made that same assumption dozens of times before he stopped Jonathan. He probably stopped other Black and Hispanic personnel and made the same assessment. The only difference is that Jonathan had the position and the resources and the determination to force accountability. Major Price, who was stopped 4 times, didn't file a complaint because she didn't think it would matter. The Navy commander, who was stopped 3 times, filed a complaint that went nowhere. How many others experienced the same thing and never said anything because they didn't believe anyone would care? The reforms Jonathan forced into existence at least make those stops visible. Data collection means patterns can be identified. Quarterly reviews mean supervisors can't ignore disparities. Early intervention means problems get addressed before they become systematic. It's not perfect, but it's better than the system that existed when Bennett stopped him that September morning. Share this if you think security personnel who racially profile should be held accountable, and systems should track their behavior before patterns develop. Because Bennett operated for 18 months before anyone noticed. 18 months of disparate stops. 18 months of people being questioned while others walked past. 18 months that ended only because he stopped someone who had the institutional power to make it matter. That's not justice working consistently. That's one person being in the right place with the right resources at the right time to force change. The reforms at least improve the odds, make the patterns visible, create oversight where none existed. But they only exist because Jonathan pushed for them instead of taking a settlement check and walking away. Most people would have taken the money and moved on. Jonathan used his leverage to change the system. And maybe, eventually, that means the next person who gets stopped won't need to be a Pentagon analyst with TS/SCI clearance to get taken seriously when they file a complaint. That would be actual progress. That would be the system working for everyone, instead of just people with power. We're not there yet, but we're closer than we were before. Jonathan walked across that parking lot, and Tyler Bennett decided he didn't belong.